There. We left off talking about Romanesque church decorations. Remember this period following the investiture conflict where the church is really quite powerful, right around the year 1100. And we see churches throughout Europe using the rounded Roman arch as a sign of allegiance with the papacy in Rome, and also as a declaration of this new power that it has in Europe. And then decorating the facades of these churches over the doorway in this tympanum area, we see a preference almost exclusively. I have to be careful whenever you say always, right? But almost exclusively, you see this preference for images of heaven opening up to people on earth. And so the church at Autun, the church with the relics of Lazarus, shows Christ at the end of time, separating the face from the dead. And the church at nearby Vézelay, with the relics of Mary Magdalene, shows Christ appearing at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. He's been resurrected, but he comes back to the apostles one last time to send them out to convert nations. So again, it's heaven opening, revealing to earth itself, and each of them focusing on Christ as this heavenly figure on a throne, like a king, like a judge, and commanding the people on the earth either toward salvation and judgment on your right, or the apostles to go out and convert the nations on your left. The church at Vézelay, the church of Saint Madeleine, you'll also notice has within the tympanum a series of 8 compartments, which we talked about very quickly at the end of class on Monday. And these compartments show the people of the earth that Christ is sending the apostles out to convert. Go ye therefore make apostles of all nations. And those represent then the different peoples of the world. For the people at Vézelay, for the people in Burgundy at this time, they are meant to represent non-Europeans. Typical, right? Christ was a Jew from the Middle East, and he gets appropriated into looking like a white guy from Europe to this day, right? Like long, straight, light brown hair. It doesn't have, the fro or anything like that. And this is the case here. He and the apostles are sort of representing in a way the European mindset, Christianity, being sent off to these other lands to convert them. And at the very end of class, we'll show there's a close-up of the apostles with their books, receiving the charge from Christ. This one was taken at night when they had artificial light on, and back when cameras had film. But that's why it's so yellow. But you can see the beams from his hands. Again, that Romanesque use of very large body parts and gestures to tell the story, which goes all the way back to Carolingian art, in particular that expressive style that we've seen everywhere. And he's sending them now out in this still Romanesque expressive style to convert nations. I'm going to hold on just a second, I'll get you. And then at the top we saw that some of the people that they are sent out to convert are depicted as being subhuman by giving them animal features. And these can be found in quite a bit of literature in the Middle Ages and earlier. The tradition of the monstrous races of the world outside of the cultural centers is something that we can find in Greek literature going back to Homer's Odyssey, if you've ever read that or heard of it. And it also reappears in quasi-scientific texts like Pliny the Elder's Natural History talks about them as well. And I think in many ways, now that we're at the end of this class more or less, we could talk about the fact that perhaps part of this might have been inspired by Egyptian, Mesopotamian art that shows hybrid creatures that are part man, part human. In this case, however, they're being used to demean them, to make them subhuman. So these were intended to be the people of India. Now, I had Carlos first, more, and then we did
just make sure that all 8 civilizations that have shown that they're trying to convert, they're non-European.
Well, non-Christian. Certainly Jews are European, and we have them as well. But it's been with the monstrous races, it's easy to figure out who they're meant to be because we have other texts that we can compare them to directly. There's manuals for crusaders, for example, that identify the people in the world they're supposed to go out on the crusades against, right? And they will then identify, well, these are the people from here, right? But the people who are identified just by their clothing can be a little bit more spotty, right? So we have what we think are Jews. We also have what we think are people from the Byzantine Empire, right? And there's a lot of there's not 100% accord on that. I don't think they are. And I've seen these people called both Indians and I forget what else, right? And Indians, right? Pakistani Indians, rather than other races. More.
Do you think that they use the animal, like the animal qualities, to mean them like in spite of what the Egyptians said they believe that they just really God, like multi God kind of, rather than like the Christianity single God, like kind of using that in a way?
That's a nice thing. That's a really good question, and I think that would make all sorts of sense if these people knew squat about Egypt. And I think that their knowledge of Egyptian culture beyond a few artifacts is going to be pretty slim, right? They certainly haven't put that stuff together. I don't know enough about the history of Egyptology to tell you sort of when they got into it and sort of things. But the Rosetta Stone, right? When did they find the Rosetta Stone? It's like in the 1920s or something that helped us decipher a lot of earlier languages. And so I think their knowledge of Ra and Anubis and all of that is pretty slight, right? But it's an interesting idea that they are trying to take their religion and sort of turn it from something that's glorious to them to something that's in fact bad, right? Again, like we saw at the Church of Otum, the general theme of the tympanum continues on the lintel, which is the crossbar down below. Remember that Otum we saw the dead rising from the grave down below so that they can meet their judgment. Down below here on the lintel we have a series also of non-Christian practices. And again, it moves from the sort of slightly unorthodox to the incredibly bizarre. And so here we are just off the center beneath Christ's feet, and we can see figures leading an animal for animal sacrifice, which is something that Christians don't have to do because Christ sacrificed for us. Them. Even though you are on that, right? So, foreigners, if you will, others, non-Christian, are defined by practice, costume, and we're going to find also on the lintel that they're equally defined by deformities as being subhuman. So on the opposite side, we have pygmies. So small they have to use a ladder to climb up on their horse, which is kind of a cute little detail here. So there's our figure down below mounting his horse, other figures behind him, and more strangely still, because, there are races of people who are diminutive, we have other figures that have these absolutely massive ears. They almost look like a Venus flytrap or something, And you can see that the figure down below, they're called Pinoti in other literature from the time. They're believed to live in the desert. And the one down below is wrapped his ears around him. And that was the myth about these people, that the desert people had these wings that they could use to shade themselves in the sun in the daytime against the heat. And then as it turned cold at night on the, desert sand, they could wrap themselves up like a blanket. Right? That's not totally made up, right? But they have a root going back to the mythologies of the ancient world. And the other legend about the Pinoti was that the wings could actually function, or the ears could function as wings, kind of like Dumbo. And that they were terribly shy, and whenever you got anywhere near them, you would never actually see them because they'd just fly away. That's a nice way to keep a myth going, right? If they ever see you, they're just going to hide, because then you can never prove them wrong. And you can also see some bird flying that you don't recognize, right? And say, oh, look, there they go. Right? So, again, it follows the same sort of theme as up above, is that we have Christ and the apostles presented as normal, and we have the people that they're sent to convert presented as other, as different. whether that difference is simply through clothing, through religious or cultural practices, or through odd deformities, whether it's dog heads, or in this case, these Pinocchio wing ears, right? So it's establishing this idea of privacy, right? That the Christians, Christ and his followers, are just by nature better than these other people. And we'll talk more about this after we get Carlos's question.
Just going the couple slides earlier, there were a lot of tempest. Was that damaged?
Yeah, that was damaged to it's not like Ichabod Crane or something like that, right? No, again, these churches, and we'll find out later tonight why. But these churches were in fact all associated with the royal crown, the French crown, which wasn't really the case at this point, right? Burgundy wasn't royal yet. It wasn't part of France. It was its own independent county. And furthermore, this was not built with any kind of funding from that noble house, right? It was independent from that. But, you get to the wars of religion in the 16th century or the period of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, that didn't matter, right? They became symbols of the old establishment and thus open for attack. This one is in an odd place. It's inside the vestibule outside the church. So you go into the church, you go through one set of doors. You enter this atrium. And there's another set of doors there to go inside. And this is on the second set, on the inside. So you got a roof over your head. And it was not destroyed, but the one on the outside was totally destroyed. And the one at Autun, with the Last Judgment, only survived because the monks at Autun, knowing that this was going on around France in the 18th century, right? French Revolution, they plastered over the entire thing. So it looked like it was already gone. And then that was cleaned off in later in the 19th century, and they recovered it, right? So it survived by the daring do of the monks who lived there. It would have been gone too. Okay, so this idea of national difference, right? Kind of what we're talking about, or geographical difference between the people of Christianity, and in this case, oddly understood to be Central European or main European, and people from other lands, is really asserted here more strongly than almost any other medieval church, and there's a reason for it, because there are certain things that happened at Vézelay that made this theme of going out to convert, of Christians traveling to other lands, coming into contact with people around the world. There are things that were going on at Vézelay that made that relevant. For example, now we're looking up at Jesus from Vézelay. Right, so standing just straight down here. The original first crusade was supposed to take place here. It was 1095. The first crusade was preached, and the original plan was to have it begin at the Church of Vézelay just before the rebuilding project that made this. So there was long already associated with the Crusades at the time that this was done. And as it turned out, after that, the Second Crusade began here, and the Third Crusade began here. This is where the knights who marched off to convert Muslims by the sword began that quest. I mean, a nastier word than quest, right? At this particular site. So the church has an association with the idea of being sent to foreign lands to see people who you think are less than you are. And the idea that you need them to come to your way of thinking, and you're justified therefore in converting them by force. Right? So that's one level in which Vézelay's sculptures function, is as a message related to the Crusades. That the Christians are intrinsically better than non-Christians. That's one of the underscoring messages. And that those who aren't Christian need it in order to be fully human. On a lighter note, the church at Vézelay was also part of what was called the pilgrimage route, which exists all the way to this day. As the Middle East became harder to visit, other sites for pilgrimage became much more popular. And the relics of St. James, one of the apostles of Christ, were kept at a town called Compostela, which you can see this map is in French, but you get the idea, right, in northwestern Spain. And beginning around the end of the 9th century, during the Carolingian era, this became a major pilgrimage site. And a whole industry built up around the pilgrimage routes. And all of them began in certain parts of what is today France, again the different duchies of the region, and they worked their way toward the Pyrenees, and they converged and went through the Christian territories of Spain to the north of the Muslim territories of Spain, which were south. As you can see on the map, Vézelay was at the very beginning of one of these routes. So there are two different reasons that this image focuses on Christian travel. One is the Crusades, and one is the pilgrimages. And both of them require this idea that Christ has sent us out from where we live to other lands. And that's the central theme on the front of Vézelay. So here's the church, right? We're inside this bit right here. Right? We're inside that door there. And as you can see, the town of Vézelay is actually built around this route that leads directly from the door and then down the hill. Right? I thought I had a line there to show it. Anybody who took the pilgrimage route would wear a badge to show that they were pilgrims. Sorry? Is it really? Oh well, screw it. You would wear a badge. I hate the mouse. But anyway, you can see. You would wear a badge to signify that you were on a pilgrimage, so that highwaymen, thieves, and whatnot wouldn't bother to try and rob you, because you had no money anyway. You were relying on the goodwill of the different churches of the route to put you up, and they were all part of the structure. And in fact, we can still do it today with legal children's passports. Have they done that? I don't think these people do something. I've been wanting to for a long time. I think it would be a great art history summer class to take a month. Because each of these churches has some of the most amazing sculpture. Romanesque sculpture. Even Santiago does as well. I've always wanted to do it, but people don't send me this. Okay, so there would be, you would wear a badge, and the back of the conch shell. Just your standard, and you can see it on the first of the fellow that serves from the right there at the sun. Now, Otun's not part of the network, but he still signifies it, right? He still puts it forth as someone who's out on religious travel. Yeah. And to this day, that remains the symbol. In fact, if you ever go to a French restaurant or a scallop, right? Conquille Saint-Jacques, right? They are the scallops of St. James. And they often come on that conch shell, right? So that became a symbol of the pilgrims that are leaving from Vézelay. And in fact, if you go outside of there it is, it's coming up now. Right? There's a little animation there. And if you go to Vézelay, I'm standing right outside the church, it's winter time, but there's the route marked with the conch shell. Right? This is back when my hair wasn't all white yet. It's not that long ago. It's like less than 10 years ago. There you go. That's the route leading up, right? So you can still take it today. And Katie Tweedle from English has taken people on part of it in the past. Right? And I have one last slide for this, right? Why do you think Shell picked this? Yeah? Shell oil, right? Well, that granted is fossil fuel, right? Is one thing, but certainly I think the people were very aware of the idea of travel and the long-standing idea of the shell being associated with travel. And some modern reference, you can go tell people to make yourself seem smart, right? Or sound smart. You are smart. Make yourself sound smart. Okay? Okay, that's it for Romanesque. It's a fairly short period anyway. It lasts about 50 years. I love Romanesque enough to spend the entire semester on it. But we quickly moved from a Romanesque architectural style where everything was based on the rounded arch to a new style of architecture beginning in the middle of the 12th century, already by 1150, it's kind of in full swing, called Gothic. And both of these terms are based, again, on the architecture. Although as we look at Gothic art, we're going to see that, in fact, there are some other differences to Gothic art about the scene and about the style of sculptures versus Romanesque. So if we look at these two buildings, Chartres Cathedral and you're right, one of the best preserved Gothic cathedrals, and Saint-Sernin in Toulouse on the pilgrimage route, one of these massive Romanesque churches. There are certain stylistic differences to the architecture of the two. There are certain architectural elements that are different, even though both of them rely on arches. Both of them are articulated in the standard basilica type, which has the nave and the side aisles. Right? We're looking down toward the altar at the far end and the apse, the type that was defined already by Old St. Peter's. But if you look at the building styles, there are some massive differences as well, some drastic differences. What's most obvious in the difference of the two? More. The points in the arches, exactly. The Romanesque arch is perfectly round, or not perfectly capital. And the Gothic arch is indeed pointed, in terms of an ogive arch. It might be coming up in this line, I forget. An ogive arch versus the rounded arch, which is a Roman arch. That's one of the principal differences. Is the use of the Roman art or the ogive art. Anything else you see with this? It's dark, that's a fault of the picture.
Isn't it common, like, I don't know. I feel like when you look at Gothic art, though, in general, I feel like it has a darker quality in general to it.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's just like the material and what they're using.
It's not, and it's usually the altar picture itself. I took this one, side summer, right? And the doors were open, so that's natural light flooding through. Gothic art is, in fact, if we're going to parse it through, we will. That's significantly lighter. I think the reason it becomes into darker is that in the 19th century, Gothic became a symbol for. We think of the Dark Ages, right? You think about vampire movies, right? Dracula is at the top, and sometimes it's in ruins that is always taking place at night. There's another story outside. Even one of the popular version of I love that sort of stuff, but that's the 19th century idea of the Gothic, which is not necessarily exactly how to do that. So what else do we have that's different about this one? Stained glass. Okay, we still have glass at Saint-Sernin, but we have stained glass. Right? Stained glass we actually trace all the way back to the 7th century, but what we have with Gothic architecture is a lot more on it. So if you look at the amount of places where you can actually see the stained glass, especially at the top, underneath the main arch of the nave, right? When we look at Saint-Sernin, we really can't see any of the windows except maybe at the very end, right? So the glass is much more prominent. It takes up a lot more of the interior space. It's another hallmark of Gothic architecture, stained glass. So oil windows, stained glass. Carl, should I have it first, then we'll get to Jeff.
I think arches are a lot next time.
Okay, so it's columns. There's a word for that as well, right? You're talking about the arches, right? You're talking about these guys up here?
There and down as well.
Here as well. Notice all of these. Here when we move to the arch, it's just sort of an edge, right? Just the brick sort of comes over and goes right over the stone, right? And up here we just have this long line of it there. But here we've got these colonnettes everywhere. Little columns. are what are called, and we'll get to this in a second as well, ribbed vaults. The vaults have ribs. I thought I was going to get here. I was going to say that. I don't know. What a rib vault does, especially the ones up right? What a rib vault does is it provides the support for the stuff on top of it. It works like it slides in an umbrella. Right? Think about an umbrella. You know, fabric and it's wrapped in a top of it. Right? You can somebody just pinches eggs at you. You can prevent it, you know. And it won't go through, even though it's just a bunch of fabric, right? Because the fabric is stretched over the top of the spine. The spine wrapped on the top down your hand. That happens here with rib vaults as well. So all of this material up in here is actually resting on these. And the weight from that comes to this very foot right here. Okay? So it's the structural innovation of the Gothic period is this use of these, as you said, accentuated arches, but it's called rib vaults. And they do this much the same thing here as well, although they're also visual. Catherine, you had kind of been
I mean, I was going to kind of and maybe not just do a lot more ornate, with more detail and more just like plain people where they're kind of trying to do as much as they possibly can to make it.
Very good. So there's a lot more visual accents everywhere. And some of them are what Carlos just said, but there are other things people look at as well. You'll notice that the primary visual accents here are things that run from the floor to the ceiling. And they direct you to the height. These pictures kind of lie. This is a good 25 feet tall. 25 feet, right? That's 3/4 taller than Senator Ned. And a lot of it accentuates that height by giving you this grouping, banding together of these shafts, right? All the way from the floor to the ceiling. Really sort of emphasize that idea of height. Verticality, yeah. And that's something that actually, if we had time to study Gothic architecture, what we find is that when the first time it's used, for each sort of successive plan, there's an attempt to make it taller than the neighbor's house. Okay, so like Lord Arlington building, there's this house on Glebe that's now stuck between two taverns. They've got that really old house on Glebe, go down to me towards the Shell station, right? There's an old house that has a double wall. They sold off part of it, and they built this monstrosity, huge. And it's like this to another tiny little one of those people randy style houses. And then one next to it just got up as well. It's like 3.5, 4 stories. And it's like he's sitting, you know, in home. Nothing. Except that they are trying to blow up each other, right? So Sharp Cathedral was put up begun actually 1145 or so, but there was a rebuilding of it around 1190 before fire. And Notre Dame Terrace is just begun, and that's only about 80 miles away. And it has gone up to like 150 feet, so the architecture says we're going to 125, right? And it is. It's going to go from 150 to 125. The next one on the other side of Paris, about 80 miles the other direction, obviously was a 144, right? And then another cathedral down in Bourges, 100 miles south of Paris, goes to 164 inches flat. Right? So, that is just getting taller and taller through these structural innovations, which we'll talk a little bit about.
I'm not sure if that's true. If this is true or not, but it looks like that one has mosaic. And the other one, am I just because we can't see that?
It's not mosaic, that's the same one.
Oh, no, because they're more like stone.
Oh, it's all bare stone. They're both bare stone. And again, I think this is a trick of the king. Right? And by the way, this also, two things. One, this was more recently cleaned by this picture. Chart has just now recently this has been lit by candles for 1,000 years now, right? 800 years. And they recently cleaned out the interior, and it was originally painted as well, right? And they've restored it to its original. A lot of people don't like it because it's used to being dark, right? The stone being darker as well.
How would they?
I mean,
I understand even if I was getting time like the history so much.
That's the sense of it. About any kind of cleaning. Do you want, once we start to clean paintings, we think, well, there's things that we tend to think, well, what do we want to look like? And then try to restore it to the way it was originally painted so that the capitals of the columns in the painted, the colonnettes that Carlos mentioned, those would have been painted in different colors as well. And it looks kind of damage to the water, doesn't it? I have. That's kind of what they're hoping to do. Right? Some people can just do one thing, so you can tell, and leave the rest of it. Do one section, so if you want to move, get back to that. Okay, so we've got these things that are drastically different, right? We've got Podian arches or ogive arches. We're taking the Roman arch. We have much more stained glass. We've got colonnettes. We've got rib vaults. Okay? All of these things have changed as we've moved our way into Gothic from the Romanesque. I have a next slide, I think, shows the walls so we can see some of what we're talking about side by side. So you can see how much more of the wall, as we look back, is given over to windows. Right? And the Romanesque church, the windows are incredibly small. This was even larger because the wall is so thick. But there's the window there. Yeah? And it's narrower even than the opening for it here because it's like it narrows toward the window, right? And in fact, you can't see the light very well up above. Here, look at the wall, you can see that the windows are right up against the nave wall up above. A lot of light comes through, right? Pictures don't pick it up so well because we kind of get to see. Right? So we darken it down a bit. But down below, we can also see quite a bit of glass allowing quite a bit of light in. Now, the reason they were able to do this, the reason they were able to get that much more window space in, goes back to these structural things that we mentioned. All of these things, right? The stained glass gets lower. The colonnettes, the rib vaults, and the ogive arch all come into play. Because once you get the rib vault, right, above, all of the weight from the vault is transferred to these four corner points. Right? Because the stuff on the outside is still in between them. It can rest on the rib. Which is nice. So you have a lot less weight than you do with a rounded arch. The rounded arch is really, really nice. Okay? That's a lot of what engineers call thrust. Okay? And that thrust from a rounded arch is in two directions. There's obviously the direct weight that's down, but with a rounded arch, at the point when it goes from being perfectly vertical to starting to bend toward the keystone at the top, there's also a significant amount of thrust outward. Okay? And that means that the wall here has to be thick in order to transfer that weight down the base. Fair enough? Right? Look at Sansonet. Look at how thick that wall is, where you can see the window down below the lower left corner. It's like 5-6 feet thick, right? Look at how thick the columns are, or those tiers that hold up the arches in the upper part of the building. Right? And now I'm looking right in here. Broad that is. That's all because of this thrust issue. So, if we start to use rib vaults and ogive arches, we get two things. One, we get a concentration of that weight at a particular point. I'm going to pour down, right? The other thing we get is with an ogive arch at the point of the spring, right, where it moves from being vertical to coming together. You still have thrust downward. You can't get rid of the weight, right? Still, but you have a lot less thrust outward. And that means this wall doesn't have to be anywhere near so thick in order to support the weight. It would also mean that if you're going to play with blocks, but you should also make the column taller than itself, because at a certain point, it doesn't matter how thick this is, if you raise it high enough, this is going to get moved. Right? Center of gravity is too high. Okay? So these two things together, the ogive arch on one hand and the rib vault on the other, help to concentrate the weight at these points and direct the thrust more vertically. That means that the space between the columns doesn't have to support the stuff in the back. And that means that before you might have been able to afford this one here. Right? You can afford a window about like that. And by afford, I mean without the building pressure. Right? It's not about the cost of building, although windows are more expensive. But here we can begin to afford pretty much to open up everything. And you can see at church, that's kind of what they did above, right? That's still down below the crust of the arch of the roof. But it's gone, the wall is gone. Right? Or all that's gone. And replaced with a non-supporting material. And even down below, if you look into the aisle of the church, you can see that most of that wall is now a window. And the wall around it is pretty thin as well. Right? The window isn't set back like what we see at San Clemente. So, for people who study the history of architecture, right, this is such a profound difference in a very short period of time. Romanesque is around 1120, 1120, 1120. Gothic people start around 1140. A rather profound shift in a new direction. And it seems as if these structural innovations, Christine, were all about to save lives. And that's what we'll talk about next. So they come there. Thanks, Mike. We'll get there. Yes, first part of it. And okay, we'll do it right now, but you'll see a slide for it later. The very first Gothic church in Nice, and some of the very early ones did not. It wasn't very sharp. But what they understood, as we talked about this rivalry and wanting to go taller than your neighbor's church, right? At a certain point, as you go taller, the thrust, however small it is, that's coming out here on the side, you got to push back, right? So here's the example for a second, right? The harder I push, the harder you got to push. Yeah. And at a certain point, you got to push back and keep pushing that over. Okay. And so what they decided, as they're trying to go taller and taller still, was that if they could put something out here on the outside, they could keep that in. Right? If you could meet that thrust back the other direction here. And this is what's called flying buttons. And so you have a bunch of space in here. Right? Empty space. This is now concrete, and it brings the thrust out of the way, and that means this whole here pretty much just hangs in there. And that's all that window that moves. Right? So you're offended by this. If the do it or into it, they weren't part of the original plan. So Gothic from Romanesque was in fact a structural term based on these very obvious differences between the two churches, which really do center on these same buttons we talked about next. We'll see, however, that as we look at Gothic art, away from the architecture itself, we'll see some differences as well, which we'll emphasize at the end of tonight and into Monday as well. The very first Gothic church anywhere is the Abbey Church of Saint Denis. And this is by sort of universal agreement. This is the first Gothic church. And it was a rebuilding plan. It was an old building going back to the 6th century. There was an abbey, that's a monastery, that was here, dating really way back, almost to the migration period, early period of the French. And it was torn down in the early 12th century by the head of the monastery, Abbot Suger, who wrote about the project. And this is where we're really fortunate as historians in that we know what he planned to do and why he planned to do it. And he basically said that the old church was way too small. That's what, again, not anybody who's anything, it's too small. Tear it down, let's build a new one. Right? So, the new one is the first Gothic church. And in his writings, he actually says part of the Gothic program, no, he didn't call it Gothic. Gothic was a deprecating term that the Renaissance artists used. Right? They saw it as coming from the Goths. When those stupid French, when the Italian Renaissance people like Leonardo da Vinci didn't like anything French. You know, he wasn't bad, but that's what we wrote about Gothic. You know, they're barbaric architecture, not reasonable like us. But dark, more, and spooky. You know, that's where that all came from. Well, Suger, he's going to build a new church. He wants the church to really allow more light inside. And to open up the walls to stained glass. He says as much. So, in the rebuilding program, it's the first time that these architects use these elements that we were just talking about, which is to say the rib vault up above, the ogive or pointed arches down below. And we can also see the effect, because if you look at the slide on your right, you can see how those rib vaults and pointed arches, ogive arches, concentrate the thrust downward onto a very slender column. Look at how wide those columns are, how big they are, compared to what we just saw a minute ago at Toulouse, where the supporting elements for the roof up above were in fact quite massive. Yeah, more.
What are the building technologies at the time? Like, how are they growing like these columns?
That's true.
And yeah, I feel like they're just
It's high quality hammers and chisels, right? There's a stone yard where they'll cut all the different materials and then transport them to the building site. There used to be marks on the individual stones so you know where they're going.
what kind of stone?
This one is, I don't know if I'm sorry, but I want to say limestone, but I'm not 100% sure. Right? But it is incredible technology. In the long and short of it, it's incredible technology. That we would be loath to do. When we put up buildings anymore and we want to look like a stone building, like Ostapenko Hall, it's just a bunch of steel I-beams with some very thin stone hung on the outside of it, right? Look at this building. Right? It's cinder block. Yeah, really, it's got an entire building of cinder block. Okay. So let's go back. Let's see how we get here. The Abbey of Saint Denis is named after Saint Denis. And Saint Denis was the first bishop of Paris. And this is where he was buried, and that's why the abbey existed here, going back for quite a while. But he comes from the 3rd century. In other words, he's just before the era of Constantine. And according to legend, he was beheaded in the year 258. But the legend goes on. Here's the outside of another Gothic building. He picked up his head after having it cut off, reached down and picked up his head and went walking, right, carrying his head until he finally decided, this is where I want to be buried, and he sat down and died, right? And that's where this is, about 10, 15 miles outside of Paris, right? By the way, these days you could just take the RER train and it'll take you, you don't have to walk hand in hand to get there. So there he is in the middle, right, Saint Denis, that one there. With his head in his hands, and that's who's buried here, right? Now, when Abbot Suger rebuilt the church because it was too small, the reason he thought it was too small was that it had too many visitors. There were people coming to see the grave of Saint Denis, these pilgrims we were talking about. And Suger writes about the fact that on high holy days, they're climbing over the backs of each other in order to participate in the communion. It's just gone all out of control. I need something bigger, people. There's not enough room for people here, right? And in rebuilding it, what Suger said was trying to do was to evoke the writings of Saint Denis, or Saint Denis. Because Saint Denis was one of the early theologians to emphasize the idea that light is a metaphor for heaven. That light is a metaphor for God. Now this is, for us today, right, Jesus is the light of the world. You hear that all the time, right? It's everywhere. But it's in the writings of Saint Denis, the early part of the Middle Ages, where this idea first gets currency, right, where it first becomes popular. And so what Suger wants is a building that reflects the writings of the saint who's buried there. He wants a building that is filled with light. But not just any light, a light that is transformed, a light that evokes the idea of heaven. And so this is where he has his architects then innovate with pointed arches, right, with rib vaults. The whole reason they're doing that is so that when you get inside the church, there aren't major obstructions to the flow of light from the windows on the outside throughout every part of the church inside. So that's what we're looking at here, is this unimpeded flow of light, this light that passes by those columns and isn't stuck behind them somewhere. You can see it everywhere you go inside Saint Denis. Again, this is an idea that the church and the experience of a church should change your experience. It should elevate your thoughts. And we've seen this in church architecture, really going all the way back to the Mesopotamians, to the White Palace, where it changed your experience from the everyday to something different. Byzantine mosaics tried to do the same thing. Change your experience. And here too, as you get inside a Gothic church, you end up in an environment that is utterly transformed by the architecture. Yeah.
They make those chairs smaller to make it look like a bigger room?
No. I don't know.
Why did those legs?
Yeah, I know. I don't know. No, it's not. There's not intended. That's a very good question, and I don't even know if those are 12th century chairs. I doubt it highly. So why they're down low like that could be the gowns of the people that sat there. I don't know. You know? That's for the pygmies. They want you to do ladders to climb up. Good try. Oh. The chairs aren't why we're here. Okay. I don't know, and the chairs aren't why we're here. So you don't need to know. You don't need to know why. But if you email me, Justin, I will look it up. And I will tell you by email exactly why the chairs are so darn short. They're kneelers. So we're meant to turn around and kneel at them?
I don't know why I should say.
Oh, like, okay, so I understand. Like, the ones that would face the back of the chair you sit on.
Yeah, because they have like other churches and stuff that have like these houses. They have like
Got it. Got it. There are, in fact, and we'll talk about those. And those I will talk about because those, in fact, do have a relevance to this. Who's buried in the sarcophagi, right? Right. Okay, so the whole point of the change in the architecture is to allow those windows to get larger and allow the light transformed by the color to flow in, okay, unimpeded. And so there we can see what quite clearly the grid vaults up above that again are directing the weight down to these columns, which can be significantly thinner because of this use of technology, because of the ogive arch and because of the ribbed vault. And I think I even have it there, right? So there's our ogive arches, which we've been talking about, and then the ribbed vaults, right? So you can use this slide as you're reviewing if you don't have this. Yes? In DC? You think about the National Cathedral, maybe. The Basilica over on Catholic campus is sort of a Byzantine Romanesque building. And the National Cathedral is in the Gothic style. Yeah. Right. So, Abbot Suger writes about light and how important the flow of light is. For him, he wants it to flow unimpeded through the church. He even calls it miraculous light. And this is because of the writings of Saint Denis, who's buried here. And from this point, after the building of Saint Denis between 1140 and 1144, when it was consecrated in 1144, it spread like wildfire, this new style did. Just people started putting up Gothic buildings, like just right down the line, straight away. Gothic building, Gothic building, Gothic building. There was like 14 bishops at the consecration ceremony in 1144, and they each went home and started building a Gothic church, right? And on one level, it's easy to see like, wow, cool new style, let's do it too. But that's not really the reason they did it. The real reason they did it is that it had royal connotations. The building was funded by the King of France. Abbot Suger is the abbot who supervises the work. He's the one who gets the show going, but he's closely connected to to the French king, to Louis VI, and to his son Louis VII. In fact, Abbot Suger even sat as sitting king of France for a while Louis VII went off on crusade. Right? So he's tight with the king, and the king gives him the money he needs for this rebuilding project. Okay? It's a royal building. And the reason Louis VI has a dog in this hunt, is that the right metaphor? Skin in the game. He's got skin in the game because it's the burial site of French kings. So the sarcophagi that you're seeing around the side are sarcophagi of different French kings going back to Charlemagne's grandson. Right? Going back to the 9th century. And had become a major burial site. So for Louis VI, in the 1140s, there's obviously a reason to have a glorious new church rebuilt to show off, right, the lineage that is eventually led to him and his power. Right? So Suger is close to him. This is part of the reason why it spread so quickly is that it's associated with the king. Furthermore, in 1140, France is independent from the Holy Roman Empire. And the French kings, through marriages, as well as through military actions, are making more and more of the territory that we know as France into France. Right? France is growing from just this little area around Paris to becoming really one of the dominant powers in Europe. So why does the style spread so quickly? People want to make sure that the king understands and others do that they're in the lead. Because everyone there is part of now France. Right? It becomes a national style of sorts. Right? They're showing allegiance. Now, in his writings, Suger describes the objects that he has in his church as well. Not only does he talk about the rebuilding, but he also talks about the things he has in the treasury, various other elements as well. And he describes this thing, which is down at the National Gallery. He tells us this is part of one of the stuff that he has in the 1140s. This wonderful old cup. It's a piece of sardonyx. That's this red stone looks kind of like agate, and it's like cameos. It has layers of sort of milky stone and layers of translucent stone, darker translucent stone. And it's been carved through. And the cup itself was carved back in the 1st century. It comes from the time of Augustus. Right? And Suger has inherited that, and he has his goldsmith fit it with a new base and arms and rim around the top. So this thing here is Roman, right? And the rest of it is Gothic. And he fit it with these stones and this beautiful metalwork, and it's going to be used for communion in his abbey. And he chooses this particular piece of Roman stone because, as you can see, as the light comes through it, it's the color of blood. Right? It's red. So it becomes this wonderful metaphor in the church for the blood of Christ, which is what it would, in Christian theology, is held. Right? And Marine first. Sardonyx. I wouldn't test it on that. Suffice to say, it's Roman stone, right? And it's been reset with these Gothic gold and precious jewels around the rest of it. And so the handles are all filigrated with gold. And again, this interest in light, I think we can see in everything we talk about, right? The gold is incredibly flashy, the jewels. It's really one of the most amazing objects that we have when we think about where it came from and the importance of this. This came from the first Gothic cathedral. And we can trace it back to that. The base of the chalice is also covered with illustration, and you can see not only the beautiful refined filigree around the jewels, but you can see there's Jesus. There's Christ staring out at us from the front of the goblet. And on the other side, we can see other plant forms in the other goblets. Just as a guess, can you figure out what plants might be flanking Jesus here? The plants in those other grapes, right? Perfect. Why grapes, Jacqueline? It's wine. What do you think the other plant might be? Oh, olive, nice choice. So what other plant might be related to the communion service? Wheat. Exactly. Bread and water, right? And that is, olive bread. So that's only one time out of the year, right? That's really only on Sunday. Primarily. But wheat, the bread every time, right? And so there we can see on the sides here, we're looking on the side of it, right? There's the grapes, and then around the back you can barely make out the wheat sheaves as well, right? So decorated with elements that remind us, right, that of the background of the symbolism of the communion service. Right? Now, on the outside of Saint Denis, and this is probably where on the outside of Saint Denis, we're looking out the front facade. It was never completed, right? The tower on the left was never filled in. But you can see that there still are some Romanesque bits, right? There's some rounded arches on your left, up above the door. And the doors themselves are almost round, not quite, but almost round. And around each of the three doors on Saint Denis, there are sculptures, like there were in old Romanesque churches, where there are sculptures on the tympanum, that archway above the door, the archivolts around the outside of it, and flanking the door on either side as well. Right? So this is all part of the rebuilding plan under Abbot Suger. There's a close-up of the central door, and you'll notice that either side of the door is flanked by some figures and niches, and then there's a series of 4 columns on either side. Each of these columns originally had a figure in front of the column, but those were destroyed in the French Revolution. Right? Here, I guess if you're a revolutionary, they were right, in that this was truly a royal church, unlike Vézelay and Autun. Whoops, sorry about that one way. Some parts of them have survived, and up at the Walter's Art Museum, we have 2 of the heads from the figures that appeared around the door at Saint Denis. And they are figures of Old Testament kings. That seems to be what appeared around every one of the doors, is a series of kings and queens. All of them from the Old Testament and meant to symbolize the lineage of Christ, his heritage stretching back into the Jewish Bible. All the way through, back and beyond that. Now, we can't identify any one of them per se, right? There's no telling which one is which. There's not enough there to identify them. But they do wear crowns. They do wear long beards, and this sets them apart as Old Testament kings. There were drawings made of them before the French Revolution, so we have some idea of what they looked like. And there were both men and women, and you can see some of the heads were missing already by the time of the Revolution. The 2 heads show some attempt at personalization, at making each of them somewhat different from the other. The eyes are still somewhat buggy, big. The parts aren't really resolved that way. But there's an interesting focus on detail. The details of the beard, the details of the waves of the hair, and of the elements of the crown that we're going to see in a lot of Gothic art. So, Saint Denis, both the architectural style, the use of stained glass, but also we'll see these sculptures set the stage for Gothic architecture, particularly in France, and eventually internationally. We're only going to have a chance to really look at France. Go ahead.
I think in like different art recovered has like there's one person that kind of like starts like the kind of like tradition or like style. Is there like one like building name, say like someone that said like kind of started as Gothic?
No, that was it. That was Saint Denis. That is Saint Denis. That is the one, yes. Now, if we look back, we can find a building that might experiment with the ogive arch, or might use a rim vault, but the first building to really bring it all together and exploit it for this idea of, getting more glass, that's Saint Denis. And most would call it the first Gothic church, right? Even though others are significantly more popular in imagination, right? So, when we think about Saint Denis and setting the stage for architecture in the Gothic period, particularly architecture in late medieval France, what we find is that as soon as Saint Denis is consecrated, other bishops who were there for the ceremony go home and start to sponsor Gothic building programs. And so Notre Dame is one of the earlier ones, not the earliest, but one of them, begun in 1163, right in the heart of Paris. And this is an important thing because, as I mentioned, part of the reason that Gothic architecture spread so quickly is that the French kings were becoming increasingly powerful. France was looking more and more like the center of power in continental Europe. And as that became more obvious, it also became obvious to the French kings that you needed a church in the capital city that reflected its status as the most important city in Europe. And for this reason, Notre Dame in Paris is put up. Now, most churches, urban churches, are dedicated to Notre Dame. So it's important to remember that this is Notre Dame Paris, even though it's the one everybody remembers as Notre Dame, right? This is the Hunchback of Notre Dame's Notre Dame. Right? So the idea of a new church is an important one for Paris, a new up-to-date church. Again, it's on the site of a very, very old church dating back to the 6th century. And our architects at Notre Dame in Paris decide, while they need a new church, they also need a big church. And they build the church taller than any church at the time. And this is now, as Robert was asking, this is where flying buttresses come in. And most people think that Notre Dame is the first place where we actually see the flying buttress. That buttress that takes the thrust of the main nave and pushes it out away from the wall so that the wall between the buttresses can be nothing but glass. Right? And I think you can see this from the outside as well, how the thrust is taken away. And it means that the wall itself, which would have to be thick to take that thrust, can now be paper thin. Right? So here's our third structural innovation. We talked about the ogive arch. We talked about the rib vault and the flying buttress. These things all work in tandem to allow the architects to fill the church with more and more glass. Right? And we'll look at glass on Monday, but today we're really kind of looking at sculpture primarily on the building. So the church at Chartres, also Notre Dame in Chartres, is about 10 feet taller than Paris. The problem with setting a standard is everybody beats it right away. But as part of this intercity rivalry, each later church getting somewhat taller. But all of them are eventually based on the type that was established by Saint Denis, where we have two spires. Saint Denis is going to have two, right? Where you have decorations around the doorways, where you have walls opening to the glass. This becomes the standard for Gothic architecture. And for most of the rest of the class, we're going to be looking at Chartres Cathedral, which is one of the best preserved examples of Gothic architecture. Here's the doorway, right? So go back, just here. All three doors lead to the center part of the church. And here's a detail of it. You can see, like an old Romanesque building, we have tympanums that are decorated. And it's important to remember here that the Gothic is not that much later than the Romanesque. It's only about 10 years later. So we shouldn't expect everything to change immediately. It follows the example of Saint Denis by putting Old Testament kings on the areas to the sides of the doors, what we call jambs, J-A-M-B-S. a door jamb. And there we can see kings and queens holding their texts, blessing us as we enter. None of them are identified. Some of them are missing. But each of them is elongated. And as you can see, their robes have that nervous energy as they drape. Busy and linear everywhere we look. And in fact, the style of the figures being very long and the drapery being all nervous is in fact a Romanesque style, but again, the date is not that much later. Gothic starts almost immediately on the heels of Romanesque, and Romanesque doesn't just go away overnight. So as one of the earliest Gothic programs, we have quite a bit of Romanesque overlap. Okay. Now we're going to look at the decorations above each of the three doors. The center door also looks kind of Romanesque. There is Christ coming back from heaven again. He's inside that almond shape that signifies heaven opening up. He's looking out at us and blessing us. He looks again like a Pantocrator almost. He's got the book on his knee and his arm raised in blessing. Here's a detail of it so you can see it a little bit better. He's surrounded by four creatures. You can see over his right shoulder is what looks to be an angel, and over his left shoulder, an eagle. The other two animals, a little bit more difficult to make out. They probably didn't have anything to pose for them. There's an ox in the lower right corner at about 4 o'clock, and a lion with wings, lower left corner, about 8 o'clock. Mark?
When I was little, I remember seeing depictions of the four gospel writers. One of them had like a animal head.
We talked about this on Monday, didn't we? Right? That each of the four gospel writers was associated with a creature. This goes back to two different prophetic books from the Bible, Ezekiel in the Old Testament and the book of Revelation in the New Testament, where each of the two writers, Ezekiel and St. John, saw heaven open up, and Christ appeared with these beasts appeared, not Christ appeared. And the beasts were, or called them beasts, was a human with wings, a lion with wings, an ox with wings, and a bird, an eagle. And theologians in the Middle Ages interpreted these to be the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Matthew is the man because he writes about Christ's earthly lineage, right? John is the eagle, Mark is the lion, and Luke is the ox. So they are meant to be the four apostles here. Here Christ is appearing now, the four gospel writers, that is. Christ is now appearing to the apostles down below. Okay. So again, we have this miraculous appearance of Christ, which is very much like Romanesque art, even though we're in the Gothic period. We should look at this as being a transitional period. Early Gothic. Where we're beginning to see certain things change with the architecture, but less so with the sculpture. That said, what's different then about the Gothic? Let's set this up for our class on Monday. What's different about the Gothic? Obviously, structure, right? Pointed arches, glass. Big thing. But, when we're looking at art rather than architecture from the Gothic period, what's different? This is what we'll see. More focus on the Virgin Mary. Christ will still be there, obviously, but we're starting to start seeing the Virgin Mary become increasingly more prominent in Gothic art. Numero uno, right? Number two, and this is still about subject matter, more focus on the earthly Christ alongside the heavenly. We didn't see much of that when we looked at Romanesque. It was all Christ in heaven coming back. But as we look at Gothic art, we're going to see an earthly Christ. A human Christ. And as we look at the issue of the human Christ, the idea of Christ being human, one of the things we're going to see with Gothic art is an interest in storytelling and an increased interest in realism. Because they're trying to tell the story of the earthly Christ. So they fill it with realistic detail. And that's what we'll see on Monday as we begin to look at these sculptures more closely and at the stained glass. Okay? I'm going to update the slide list this weekend, and I'll send you an email when I've done it. I'll try to get the PowerPoint's almost done for this. I'll get that up early if you want to start to make flashcards and stuff. You'll have it 12 before Monday. But remember, we do have class normal on Monday for the powers that be, right? So good luck for this weekend, getting ready for stuff, and we'll see you Monday.